Great. Thanks, Jim. Really appreciate it. Appreciate the invite to this event. As Jim said, my name's Brendan O'Leary. I'm with Gitlab. So unsurprisingly, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about software than our last talk about networking. I've been at Gitlab since October of 2017. Or as I like to say, I've been at Gitlab for 800 employees, because we've hired 800 people in the time that I've been here. I was number about 170 or about 970 today. So what do I want to talk about today? So I think that 8 years ago, Mark Andreessen said famously that software was eating the world. I would say that software has eaten the world by now. And more recently, Mark was quoted again by saying that cycle time compression, that is the time to take something from an idea and deploy code into production, is the most underestimated force that is going to determine winners and losers in tech. And winners and losers in tech are also going to be the winners and losers in their industries, as every company is a software company. And I think it's obvious to a lot of people if you think about it, right? We want to skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where we think it's going to be today. And so the faster that we can iterate and make changes, the more likely we are to be able to get to the optimal solution in the end. And I think it's only getting faster, right? There's been a number of tectonic shifts. I've been in software for, I don't know, probably 15 years. And there's been a number of tectonic shifts in that time frame about how we think about and deploy software that I think really have impacted and sped up that acceleration each time. And I think the fact that we're here at a multi-cloud conference is a testament to that, right? Because we've seen how quickly the cloud has gone, right? Remember, the cloud was only, AWS was only released in 2006. And so it's not been that long. And now we're talking about running across cloud and in multi-cloud. And I think my journey to the cloud started not long after that. Story I like to tell about that is I worked for a healthcare software vendor for about 10 years. And much like financial institutions, it's a very sensitive kind of development environment where you don't want to put too much in the cloud, or how could we ever put anything in the cloud? But I was walking back to my office one day, and my office was just past the server room, and the server room door was open, which is never like a good sign that the door's just sitting open. And as I'm walking past, I turn to my left, and I see one of our lead developers, one of our most senior developers, and he has a server on his lap and a screwdriver in it, right? Because something was broken, and he needed it to do his job, and so he just went in and started fixing it. And that was the day that I realized I don't want my top engineers, who are supposed to be building software for my customers, in the server room with a screwdriver, right? And so I think that's what has brought us to what I'm going to talk about today, right? The situation we're in is that actually hybrid multi-cloud is already the reality that we're living in. And the problem that's causing us is disjointed, uncontrolled, inefficient processes, right? And so we'll talk about, actually, ironically, one of my pillars later is visible, which we just heard about. And so I think one of the things, the key question to answer is how can we enable workload and workflow portability? And I'm going to talk about those two things differently in just a minute. And I think the answer for software developers and folks that are trying to enable those software developers to deploy applications is to focus on a DevOps platform as the on-ramp to multi-cloud for our developers. So first, let's talk about my assertion that hybrid multi-cloud is the reality and the future for all enterprises. Well, there was a 2019 State of Cloud report that came out that said 84% of organizations are already using multiple clouds. And in the average organization, they're using 4.5 private and public clouds, right? The reality is you no longer just choose one cloud and go with it. You're going to have acquisitions. You're going to want a negotiation position with partners. You're going to want functionality that might be available in only one of the clouds. And so that's why we're seeing this huge, yet another tectonic shift. And actually, this report also said that 60% of enterprises were using or considering Kubernetes. And that's up almost 50% from just 12 or 24 months before. And it's not just Uber and Facebook and those kinds of companies that are out west that are doing this. It's every industry, it's every vertical. This list is not necessarily a GitLab list. This is actually from the Kubernetes case study website. So this is from Kubernetes.io. And you'll see here, industries. We see financial institutions, which we just heard talking up here, insurance providers, startups surely, but also nonprofits, GMOs, banks, and even government customers, right? They're all looking at Kubernetes for workload and workflow portability. And so what do I mean by that? Well, workflow portability means I want to be able to keep my developers in their flow, developing the applications, again, delivering that differentiated value for my customer, not with screwdrivers in their hands. And because of that, I want to be able to choose the cloud that has the inherent value for what I'm delivering. And that also comes and gives me a key to achieve that kind of multi-cloud environment, right? And then to enable this workflow portability, you have to have a focus on DevOps as a process. And that's where Kubernetes is so important, because Kubernetes also brings workload portability, right? That's the promise. It's the ticket to multi-cloud for enterprises. It's the ticket to how can we deploy in more than one cloud without getting too bought in or focused on one vendor. But also, I would postulate that Kubernetes also benefits cycle time compression that we talked about earlier, and your DevOps transformations if it's placed in the hands of developers. When you place it in the hands of developers in the right way, you can run workloads where it makes the most sense technologically and economically. So I'm just interested here, how many folks are using Kubernetes in production today? Just raise your hand. I think that's, well, maybe a little less than 60%, but it's very close to that. How many are considering it if you're not using it already today? Okay, now I think we hit probably almost 100% of the room, right? Again, I think without going into that with a plan, that's what we heard about earlier, what that can end in is kind of this disjointed, inefficient process. In enterprises large and small, you can end up with very vendor-specific implementations of something. You can end up with shadow IT, right? It's no longer somebody's got a box underneath their desk where they're running something, but they've got some box in GCP we didn't know about, right? And so if we've been talking about DevOps for so long, and we've been talking about this for so long, why are we not there, right? Like why are we not there? Why are we here trying to learn how to get there? And in fact, another survey showed that 90% of IT professionals thought that DevOps had not reached its promise. And again, I think that's a lack of focus on the holistic view of DevOps, right? So example I give here is previous to Gitlab, I actually inherited a stack at a contractor to the US federal government. I live near DC where everyone is a contractor to the US federal government. So I was there for a period of time. And on my first day, I was handed a Word document that was 11 pages long about how to deploy the solution for the customer. And the reason for that was, well, when the developers run it on their computer, they're using Minikube. And when we deploy it into our environment where we can have test data from the customer, well, that's in a virtual environment. And when we deploy it to the customer's test environment, that's a different virtual vendor, but also virtualized. And when we deploy it to production, well, that's on bare metal. And so the only way that they had solved for that at that point was, well, let's just write down an install script that's 11 pages long. Right? And so that's obviously not the intended outcome of DevOps. And I think that creates for us this kind of tool chain crisis, right? We've done it to ourselves. We've tried to take tools that were made for on-premise and apply them to the cloud, right? We heard that from the networking vendor before. We've tried to cobble together our own solution, and we haven't focused on the process. We focused on what's the right tool, and you kind of end up with that, which is a visual representation of that Word document I was telling you about. And it's going to get worse. And why is it going to get worse? It's going to get worse because microservices are a thing, right? It's a buzzword you hear, but has a lot of traction in industry. And 86% of leaders think it's going to be the default architecture in the next 5 years. And when you're moving to a microservices architecture, you're just exploding this problem, right? You get the benefits, right? The reason people talk about microservices is, well, now I can move to market faster, I can have stable APIs between things, I can leverage cloud computing and orchestration the way it was meant to be leveraged. But the challenge that comes with that is fragmentation, right, of process, fragmentation of data, right? Data becomes siloed or is fragmented. And then it's a lot harder to grok as a human a large set of microservices rather than a monolith. And so operating that becomes a lot harder. And so, given those challenges, how do we think we can answer this? Well, I've got a little bit of a framework that I want to talk about to help us ask the right questions, and then we'll talk about DevOps platform around that. So I don't think the only questions are the ones that we've talked about so far. I think the other key is things like stability and reliability. What's the cost going to be? Right? These are concerns that we all have and our businesses have, and have to be weighed along with the other decisions that we're making about multi-cloud. And there's a price that we pay in doing this, right? And so, yeah, we don't have someone with a screwdriver in a server room maybe, but somebody logging into AWS on the console or going into the Gitlab console, right? That's the screwdriver, right? Like it's still that screwdriver in a server, even if it's not a physical screwdriver. And so the time that we spend acquiring all these different tools, integrating everything together, and forcing users to context switch, that's all a lot harder to measure than the other things like stability and scalability and cost, real dollar cost. But these are real costs we have to be considering as well as the question that we're trying to answer. And so let's say we see all those questions, we're worried about all those things. How can we really achieve that promise of multi-cloud? Well, again, I think the answer is a DevOps platform, right? And so the reason that's the answer, I wish I could just say, and I know my marketing wishes I could just say, well, just buy something from Gitlab and it's fixed. But I don't think that's the whole answer. I think the answer is it's not any one tool necessarily. It's a platform that your developers can consume and have an easy on-ramp to deploy software, right? Again, we want the developers focused on differentiated work that benefits our customers, not on how it's going to be deployed and how we're going to stitch the servers together. And to do that requires like a level up of thinking, right? Again, I think that's a reason we're all here because, sure, it's great to go to reInvent, but that's going to be a level down, right? That's going to be in the tools of AWS and what AWS can do for me. But we're here because we want to learn about how can we think a level above that. And I think when we're considering what we need for a DevOps platform, again, we want to level up that discussion. And so I think the thing to think about is what are the required capabilities for our business, right? We heard a lot of that from Jefferson earlier, right? Like, what are the real requirements, right? Before we start building an architecture and start, coding a solution or deploying something to Kubernetes, what is required of us for the business, right? And so I've got some examples here, right? I think there are things that can help, but they're probably not the right thing for everyone's business, right? But I think that if we have a consistent and efficient developer experience, that's going to make it more likely that developers are going to be able to use that and consume it, and you'll decrease the chance of shadow IT and the shadow GCP box under the desk. I think centralized reporting and visibility is key. Again, I'm going to talk more about visibility in a second, and it's interesting that was right before me in the talk, because I think that is critical. If we're not considering that, we're going to have a really hard time, understanding what's happening in this much more complex environment. And then I think the other key is to have business metrics. How are these things going to actually positively impact the business? Is it going to be that we're going to be able to take time to market and cut it down? Are we going to decrease the amount of failures that come from changes? What are the business metrics that we're really driving towards? And answering these questions and having a clear framework then can help you make decisions about, okay, what's the right way to implement a platform for this? And there's some key stuff missing from that last slide, right? I didn't say the word serverless or Kubernetes once. I didn't say anything ending in as a service. And don't tell Jim and the organizers here, but I didn't even say the word multi-cloud or hybrid cloud, right? Because again, those are a little bit more in the weeds than where we need to be making these decisions that impact how we use all of these different tools. And I'm not alone in this, so I found a great report from McKinsey Digital called Unlocking Business Acceleration in a Hybrid Cloud World. If I had found that before I was writing the talk, I probably would have just presented it and called it my own. but because it really is in line with this operating model and a consistent way of looking at what we're doing and why we're trying to build what we're building, and having one consistent way of doing that regardless of where we're deploying the software to. And so again, I've got kind of 3 pillars that I think a single DevOps platform can give folks, and a single on-ramp to the cloud can give our developers and our businesses, which is visibility, efficiency, and governance. And I'm just going to talk real briefly about each of those. Visibility, we talked about that on the previous talk a little bit. We want to see everything that matters, keep developers in their flow, and we don't want to be syncing between groups. Efficiency, right? We want to get started immediately. We want like one sheet of paper, one sheet of music for everyone, developers, quality assurance, security professionals to be working off of. And governance, of course, no matter what industry we're in, governance is important, right? None of us want to wake up to the middle of the night call about there being some security bug that we should have known about that now we're getting a call about. And we want to be able to act with certainty, right? We want to give developers and operators the certainty that at the end of our DevOps pipeline, the end of that life cycle, we're going to be deploying code that's as safe as it can be. And so again, this is just kind of the way we visualize it, but I think it's critical to not just think about deploying the code, not just think about releasing it, but think about all the way from planning what we're going to build, all the way to monitoring it. And how does all of those things impact that entire platform and that entire life cycle so that we can make sure that we're making decisions that aren't kind of based in a solution already. And there's some customers that have done this. I'd love you to, this is new since I've been writing this, but there's great videos on our YouTube from Delta and Genworth, who spoke at a conference recently about their DevOps platform. Again, not entirely my tool, so it's just them talking about how they've built the platform for developers, where there's one space for their developers to collaborate and work together. But a couple other customer examples. So a networking monitoring tool, Passler, their real problem was quality assurance. They didn't have any visibility into how that was happening because it was all happening in a separate system. There wasn't any integration with the rest of the flow. And when they were able to integrate that, they actually sped up by 120% and released 4 times faster by bringing everyone onto one platform and automating a lot of that QA. Ticketmaster is obviously one of the largest ticket websites in the world. It's actually the 5th largest e-commerce site of any kind. And I really encourage you all to look them up. They talk a lot. Tim and a lot of the other folks talk a lot about Kubernetes and their road there. They, of course, have a very classic use case for needing to be able to scale really fast, right? Like Taylor Swift's tickets come up, you gotta scale. But again, they were having a hard time with the time to deploy, right? So if they needed to fix something, it was actually taking almost 2 weeks for something to get from, hey, we need a fix, to its deployed in production. And now they do that with Kubernetes and a single DevOps platform in an average of about 8 minutes. And then lastly, just because it's cool to talk about space, ESA was having a hard time with collaboration, right? So they had lots of different teams, different kinds of engineers, as you can imagine, when it comes to building space probes for space. And bringing a single DevOps platform, again, gave them that visibility, gave them a great view of how the project's running, and created a culture of collaboration where there was a single source of truth for everything that was going on in the business. Great, and that's some examples. Again, these slides are available publicly, and I really appreciate your time.